So the Buddhist idea of non-self is complicated, and there's a way of understanding it sort of intellectually, and there's a way of understanding it more deeply in our bones. And there's a great story from the early tradition that highlights this difference and tries to, I think, explain it in a way that makes it understandable. So we'll discuss that story coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing. So non-self, this idea that we shouldn't identify ourselves with any of the aspects of our experience, anything that we see in our lives, that we should strive not to identify with parts of the world, that is, I think, an essential part of early Buddhism, and indeed really most of Buddhism that we find through history. So, and one of the, I think, things about that particular teaching of the Buddha is that it's difficult, and many of us can at least understand the outlines of it in an intellectual way. But there's a difference between understanding the outlines of it in an intellectual way, which many of us can at least think we can do, and understanding it really deeply, understanding it in our bones in a way that really makes a difference to our behavior and our lives. And I think this difference between understanding something intellectually and understanding it deeply is something that we come face to face with again and again in practice. And that's why when we're practicing to become, let's say, wiser and kinder and calmer, part of that practice is intellectual, is understanding things, is learning things. But the deeper part of the practice is getting beyond the mental part, the sort of the intellectual part, which I think gets many people kind of interested and arguing and debating and all these things, but getting it deeper into how we actually behave in the world. So to that end, there's a really interesting story from the early Buddhist texts, from the Pali Canon, that deals with an older monastic, an older monk. And the word for monk in Pali is bhikkhu, so I'll use the word bhikkhu sometimes. Bhikkhu just means monk. And so there's this elderly bhikkhu named Bhikkhu Khemaka, and Khemaka is ill. It's pretty clear from the text that he's perhaps on the point of death, in the sense that he's getting very sick. He's probably old and in a place in his life where the kind of sickness that has accosted him is the kind of thing that might eventually kill him. And in this story, we don't hear about the Buddha in particular. We don't hear about his presence in any way. So it's probable that this story happened, or at least that would be my supposition, that the story is from a time after the Buddha's passing, where what we have is a group of monks. They don't have recourse to the actual Buddha, so they have to sort of figure out what to do on their own. And they're worried about Khemaka. It seems that Khemaka lives apart from the monastics, perhaps, I don't know, a bit of a walk away, maybe a mile. And he's with another monastic named Dasaka, and so Khemaka and Dasaka are sort of cohabiting together, and the other monastics are a ways away. But all the monastics are concerned about Khemaka, and one of the things they're in particular concerned about with him is whether or not he has attained awakening. And we'll know, if we know anything about sort of early Buddhism, we'll know that, and indeed Buddhism generally, in the Theravada understanding, once you become awakened, then your rebirths are over. So the idea is that if Khemaka has not attained awakening, then in his next life he's going to be reborn. He's going to be reborn into another life. He's going to have to go through this whole process again of learning the Dharma and all the rest. Whereas if he's attained awakening, then this is his last life, and that's a good thing in Buddhism, because in early Buddhism, you're trying to escape the rounds of birth and death. You're trying to escape dukkha, which is the unsatisfactory nature of the world, through understanding it, through understanding the world deeply. And so these, the other monastics and Khemaka's companion, Dasaka, are concerned to know whether he has attained awakening, because he is so close to death. And the way that they do that is to basically interrogate him a bit about his understanding of non-self. So they're using his understanding of non-self as kind of a window into whether or not he is awakened yet. So in particular, Dasaka the companion of Khemaka, asks Khemaka, do you consider any of the 5 aggregates yourself? Now, the 5 aggregates, if you don't know what those are, I'll put up a link to an earlier video of mine on the 5 aggregates. But roughly speaking, the 5 aggregates are the sort of what constitute the person, the human person, or any kind of sentient person, and at least in this realm, shall we say. And they contain, basically what it is the first aggregate is form, which is our physical body, and then there are 4 aggregates of the mind, which are perception and feeling, that is positive and negative feelings, pain and pleasure, volition, that is will, and consciousness. And so all these 5 make up the person. And so Dassaka asks Khemaka, he asks him, do you consider any of those yourself? And Khemaka says, no, I don't consider myself to be my body or my consciousness or my perceptions or any of the other ones. And then Dassaka asks Khemaka, do you consider that any of these belong to yourself? And Khemaka once again says, no, I don't think of any of these as belonging to myself. These are the 2 ways that the Buddha talked about non-self, is that when we're impacted by or are aware of any parts of the world, any parts of reality, any parts that we can see around us, we should think of them as non-self, meaning that they aren't who I am, no matter what they are in the world, because they're always changing, and that they're not mine, they're not really part of myself in any kind of ultimate way. There are things that simply come and go. There's simply things that arise and pass. So Dassaka takes this information and goes to the other monastics and says, okay, so my friend Khemaka, who's very ill, he says that he doesn't think of any of the 5 aggregates as his self, and he doesn't think of any of the aggregates as belonging to a self. And so the other monastics confer among themselves and basically say, well, then he must be awakened, because that is the characteristics of the belief of somebody who is awakened, that they're not going to believe these things. They're going to believe that basically they're going to believe non-self, this notion of non-self, that nothing in the world is their self and nothing in the world belongs to a self. So then Dassaka makes the long walk back to Khemaka and basically tells him, congratulations, you must be awakened. It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? I've conferred with the other monastics and everyone agrees that you must be awakened because of these beliefs of yours. So, this is your last life. And Khemaka, one guesses sort of wearily, says, no, I'm not awakened yet. I know how my mind is and it's not yet awakened. And this is the surprise. This is the surprise to Dassaka, because he seems to fit the characteristics, and yet here he is saying he's not awakened. And so Khemaka goes a little further. He says, and I'll read from the text, the notion I am has not yet vanished in me in relation to these 5 aggregates, but I do not regard anything among them as this I am. So this is a kind of I wouldn't say a paradox, but almost a paradox. He says that he still has this notion of self with these 5 aggregates, but none of the individual ones or any combination or, is what he can pinpoint as his self. And so Dassaka is kind of concerned and goes back, walks the mile or whatever to the other monastics and tells them what Khemaka has said. And there results this kind of back and forth of, what about this? And Khemaka responds. And eventually Khemaka says enough. Basically, this sort of back and forth with Dassaka and these other monastics is kind of wearying. It's annoying. You have to wait for the response from the other monastics. Then they have other annoying questions to ask. And so Khemaka finally gets out of his bed, takes his staff, and walks in one has to assume, a state of some illness, infirmity, walks however long it is, the mile or whatever, to where the other monastics are staying, because he realizes he's going to have to talk to them in person to get all this stuff out of the way. And so what he says is that although he doesn't have an idea of self, there is still what might be termed a residual conceit of the notion of I am. And in early Buddhism, the notion of conceit is a kind of a very a thin kind of comparing mind, of comparing ourselves to others as self and other, comparing in the sense of better or worse, or the same, whatever, however the comparison is, it's nevertheless a comparison of selves. There is this kind of residual kind of conceit of a self there, even though intellectually, it seems, he understands all that he has to understand about non-self. And the other monastics, of course, have been asking him about the 5 aggregates and how is his self identical with any one of them, and he keeps saying no. And so Khemaka comes up with a simile or metaphor. He says, it's like a lotus, the scent of a lotus. He says, the scent of a lotus isn't the scent of the lotus's stem, or its petals, or its stamen and pistils, all the parts of the flower. It's the scent of the entire flower. Now, I don't know if that's actually true. I kind of tend to think the smell probably comes from some part inside, but nevertheless, let's assume that Khemaka is right, and the scent comes from the entire flower. It doesn't really matter. The point is, in the same way, it's not that Khemaka thinks that any particular part of the aggregates is his self, but still there's a kind of a residual sense of self that sort of perfumes or permeates these aggregates, a kind of a residual fragrance of self there, even though he knows it isn't identical to any of the parts. And I think he uses the metaphor of the lotus because the lotus is a metaphor that goes quite far back in Buddhism. The Buddha himself used the lotus flower to signify the purity of the Dharma and of the awakened being that comes out of the mud of ordinary existence and yet does not retain any mud, that the mud sort of slides off of it. Nevertheless, Khemaka, I think, comes up with a second simile, which I think is a little bit more pungent and pertinent, I think, here, which is the simile of the stained cloth. He says, it's as though you have a cloth that has been stained. Say it's gotten some excrement on it. Perhaps it's a cloth that you use as underwear or something. And as a result, it's stained and smelly. And you take it to the washerman, the laundryman, which is interesting because it gives a little bit of an insight into ancient India, that there were people who spent their time washing clothes. And so you take it to the laundryman, and the laundryman then spends a while beating it and using soap and lye and different kinds of ingredients to get it clean, and then he'll give it back to you at the end. And he says, at that point, when you get the cloth back, it is no longer stained, it is clean. Nevertheless, the cloth may retain some of that residual odor, either from the dirt that was on it, the excrement perhaps that was on it. It may still smell a little bit like that, or it may smell of the strong soap that was used on it, which is sort of unpleasant. So it may still retain some unpleasant odor, even though the cloth is clean. And so Khemaka says, continuing the simile, you have to do with that cloth, what you have to do is to fold it up and put it into a sweet-smelling box, let's say a cedar wood chest or something. And if you put it in the sweet-smelling box, then the smell, let's say the smell of cedar wood it might be, permeates the cloth, and over time, that last residual scent, that last residual odor, bad odor, finally goes away. And so after time in that chest, then the cloth is completely clean in the sense of not only being literally clean, but also clean of any smells, and then you can use it to wear. And so this is, I think, a very pertinent metaphor or simile that Khemaka is using, and he says in the same way, even though he understands, or one understands, anybody might understand the intellectually about non-self, that yourself isn't identical to any one of these aggregates, and that they aren't really in a possession, any of these aggregates isn't really a possession of the self. Nevertheless, there can be retained for a long period of time this sort of residual odor of self that just continues for a time. And he says, as a result, once you get to that point intellectually, let's say, then you have to continue your practice. And the practice is one of viewing the arising and passing of the sense of self as it happens over time, and viewing the arising and passing of each of these 5 aggregates in your experience as they arise and pass over time. And seeing those can, over time, again, just like that cedar chest, can, over time, tend to reduce this odor of self until it goes away at the end. It can reduce the residual conceit that we talked about, this conceit I am, can reduce the residual desires to be consistent, to be constantly existing, let's say, to be reborn, to be immortal, let's say. I mean, that's a desire that many of us have, is a desire not to die, and never to die, and to always be alive. And that is the kind of residual conceit or desire that goes away over time. And in general, what goes away with this kind of practice is these residual underlying tendencies that we have towards I, me, and mying, if you like, towards seeing the world in terms of a self. And so this here, I think, gets at the distinction between an intellectual understanding, which Khemaka certainly had, and a deeper understanding, which he was honest enough to admit he didn't have yet. So, and I think many of us may be in this situation of Khemaka, or not even quite as far, let's say, as Khemaka, but we may think of ourselves even as being in a similar situation, in the sense that we may intellectually understand that none of the aggregates are our self in any kind of a permanent way. We may understand that none of the aggregates belong to a self in any kind of ultimate way. They are their own thing, that they are doing their own thing, that they are coming and going whether or not we want them to, and all the rest. And yet, there still is this quite pungent, powerful odor of a self still there. And I think, therefore, the story gets at that difference. And then finally, having said this story, having given this discussion or this talk to the monastics then respond to Khemaka and say, they were very sorry to have troubled him to come all the way over here. They didn't mean to disturb him from his rest, because obviously he's sick. But they did want him to at least, sort of delve deeper into the Dharma in this regard, so as to explain the Buddha's teaching in a way, presumably, that would not only help himself, help Khemaka perhaps to understand these things better for himself, but also to help the other monastics, because they must have, given the way the story went, they must have believed that Khemaka was a very good teacher. And so it said at the end that a bunch of the monastics attained awakening, including Khemaka himself, which is sort of the Disney, the Hollywood ending that a lot of these suttas tend to have. But nevertheless, it's I think a very interesting, and I hope it's a useful story to you. If you like it, give it a thumbs up. If you're a long-time viewer, consider subscribing or check out the Patreon link down below. So thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. Now, meanwhile, do be well.